He was 7 years old, wearing a navy blazer he'd asked for himself, standing in the middle of one of the most expensive hotel lobbies in Manhattan, and he was staring at a man who made grown men flinch. His mother, Alina, saw it happen in slow motion. She'd looked up from her phone for half a second. That was all it took. Because Mateo had already crossed the marble floor, stopped 3 feet from the stranger in the charcoal suit, and tilted his head the way he always did when something didn't add up. "Excuse me." His voice was calm, almost polite. "Why do you keep staring at my mom like you know her?" The lobby didn't go quiet, but it felt like it did. Because the man Mateo had just walked up to was Dante Valcourt, and nobody walked up to Dante Valcourt uninvited. Alina's legs stopped working. She watched Dante look down at her son, watched his expression shift from cold authority to something she had never once seen on his face in the 2 years she'd known him. Confusion, raw, unguarded confusion. Because Mateo wasn't just brave, he was unmistakably Dante's son. The same dark eyes, the same set jaw, the same stillness that didn't belong on a child. Dante's mouth opened, then closed. "I thought I recognized someone," he said finally, his voice low and careful. Mateo considered this. "You were starring for almost 3 minutes. That's not recognizing someone, that's something else." And that was the moment Alina stopped being frozen and started calculating how fast she could get to the elevator. 8 years earlier, she didn't know what Dante was. Not really. She was 23, working as a private events coordinator for a firm that handled galas, charity dinners, and the kind of parties where nobody asked where the money came from. Her boss had handed her the Valcourt account like it was a promotion. Organize a private fundraiser at the estate in Boston. Black tie, 200 guests, everything flawless. She remembered driving through those iron gates for the first time and thinking she had never seen anything so beautiful and so cold at the same time. The estate sat on the edge of the water, old stone and tall windows, and the kind of quiet that money buys on purpose. The staff moved like they had been trained not to exist. And at the center of it all stood Dante Valcourt, 31 years old, watching her walk across the entrance hall with the patient attention of someone who was used to deciding things. He shook her hand, said her name once like he was testing the sound of it, and then he let her work. She learned what he was gradually, the way you learn the temperature of water by staying in it too long. The men who stood near the doors weren't just security. They had a different kind of stillness, the kind that came from being trained to hurt people efficiently. The phone calls Dante took in the other room always ended with someone's voice going very quiet on the other end. The name Valcourt, she discovered, meant something specific in Boston. It meant stay out of the way. It meant don't ask. She should have finished the event, sent the invoice, and never gone back. She didn't. The fundraiser ran over schedule, and Dante had offered her a drink while the last guests filtered out. She told herself it was professional, one conversation. He asked her opinion on something about the evening's program, and she gave it honestly, including the part where she thought the speechwriting was self-congratulatory and the catering had been overpriced for the quality. He'd looked at her for a long moment after that. Then he laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. "Nobody talks to me like that," he said. "I'm not talking to you," she told him. "I'm talking to a client." He smiled. Same thing. It wasn't, but she let herself believe it was for a while. Over the following months, he called her firm for 2 more events. Then he called her directly. She told herself each time that she was being professional, that the line was still clear, that she knew exactly where she was standing. But Dante had a way of making the world around him feel very small and very specific, like the only thing that existed was the room you were in with him and the conversation happening right now. He listened when she talked. He pushed back when he disagreed. He never once made her feel small. She found out what his family really was on a cold night in November, when she overheard a conversation she wasn't supposed to. 2 men in the east corridor of the estate, voices low, names she recognized from news headlines she'd filed away without wanting to examine too closely. The Valcourt name had roots that went back 3 generations and spread sideways into things that didn't have clean names. Organized crime was the official term. His family called it business. She went home that night, and sat in her apartment for 2 hours, trying to talk herself into ending it before it became anything she couldn't walk away from. Then he called, and she answered, and she told herself 1 more week. She told herself 1 more week for 6 months. She found out she was pregnant on a Wednesday morning in March. She stood in her bathroom for a long time after the test, not moving, just letting the information settle into her body like something she already knew but had been refusing to name. She was 24. She was in love with a man whose family ran the northeast corridor of organized crime. She was going to have his child. She told him that Thursday evening. Drove to the estate, sat across from him in his study with the fireplace going and the city invisible beyond the dark windows, and she said the words plainly because she had never been someone who buried things. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't say anything immediately. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the fireplace, and the silence stretched long enough that Alina felt the exact shape of her mistake. When he finally spoke, what he said was, "My father cannot know about this. Not we'll figure this out together. Not I love you and we'll find a way." Just that. Cold and precise, like she was a variable in an equation he needed to solve. She nodded, said she understood, and she left. She drove home on autopilot, sat in her parking garage for 20 minutes before she could make herself go inside. And when she got upstairs, she called her older sister, Cora, who answered on the second ring and said nothing for a full minute after Alina told her. Then Cora said, "You need to listen to me carefully." She told Alina about a woman named Patricia Solano, a journalist who had spent 2 years investigating the Valcourt family's financial operations. She got close to something real, and then she disappeared. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way things disappear when powerful people decide they need to. Her name appeared occasionally in true crime forums and cold case threads, but the official story was that she'd moved abroad voluntarily. Nobody who knew the Valcourt name believed that. "You're not just a secret," Cora said. "You're leverage. You're a problem they didn't create but will absolutely solve. If Dante's father finds out you're carrying the next Valcourt heir, one of 2 things happens. Either they own you forever, or they decide an uncontrolled variable is too risky." Alina already understood this. She had just needed someone to say it out loud, so she couldn't pretend she didn't. She left Boston 5 days later. She packed 2 suitcases at 3 in the morning, left a note for her landlord, sent her boss a resignation email with no explanation. Cora drove her to the bus station because she didn't want a flight record, and they held each other in the parking lot for a long time without saying much. "He'll look for you," Cora said. "I know. What if he's not like his father? What if he would have protected you?" Alina pulled back and looked at her sister. "I was 24 and pregnant, and his first response was to protect himself. I couldn't afford to bet my child's life on the possibility that he'd be different when it counted." Cora nodded slowly. "Okay, go." She went. She moved to a small town in western Pennsylvania under her mother's maiden name, rented a room from an elderly woman who didn't ask questions, took bookkeeping work remotely, learned to be invisible in the specific, practiced way that terrified people learn. She waited for someone to come. Nobody did. Mateo was born in October, in a small regional hospital, with Cora holding her hand and a playlist of soft music. Alina had made at 2 in the morning during her 8th month when she couldn't sleep. He came into the world quietly, wide-eyed, already looking around the room like he was taking inventory. She cried for an hour after he was born, not from pain, from something she didn't have a clean word for, relief and grief and a love so enormous it felt dangerous. She named him Mateo, Dante's middle name, which she had found once on a document she wasn't supposed to see, and which she had kept because she couldn't bring herself not to give him something, even something invisible. The first year was survival in its purest form. She worked during nap times, slept in 2-hour stretches, ate whatever was fast and cheap, and studied for her events management certification in the margins of every quiet moment she could find. Cora visited twice and cried both times watching Alina function on so little. "You're incredible," Cora told her once. "I'm just not stopping," Alina said. "There's a difference." When Mateo was 2, she moved them to upstate New York. When he was 4, she moved to the city, because Manhattan was the best place she knew to disappear without disappearing. A city of 8 million people moving too fast to look closely. She rebuilt her career from scratch, leveraging her certification and her genuine talent for logistics into a serious reputation in corporate event planning. By the time Mateo was 7, she was running her own small firm and turning down contracts she didn't want. She had built something real, something hers. And Mateo was something she still didn't have language for. He had taught himself to read before she started teaching him, working through picture books with the focused determination of someone who had already decided they needed this skill. By 4, he was reading chapter books. By 5, he was asking questions about things she hadn't mentioned yet, connecting dots between conversations that happened days apart. He watched people with an intensity that sometimes made adults uncomfortable, a steady, patient attention that didn't feel like a child's curiosity so much as a naturalist's observation. He was not a performance. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just, quietly and completely, the sharpest person Alina knew, and the fact that he was also 7 years old and still asked for extra syrup on his pancakes was one of the great paradoxes of her life. He never asked about his father directly. He asked around it. Careful questions, oblique angles, the way someone probes a bruise to map its edges without pressing the center. Once, when he was 5, he'd looked at her over breakfast and said, "Did my dad know about me?" She had put down her coffee and looked at him. "No, baby, he didn't." Mateo had nodded slowly, like he was filing this information in the right folder. "Okay," he said, and he went back to his toast. She had cried in the shower that night for 20 minutes. She raised him to be honest and curious and unafraid of big questions. She raised him to hold doors and make eye contact and say what he meant. She raised him, without planning to be exactly like his father in every way that had once made her fall in love with a man she should never have trusted with her heart. The conference in Manhattan was a pharmaceutical client, a 2-day event, routine work, the kind she could manage without much effort. She'd brought Mateo because her usual sitter had a family emergency, and the conference didn't start until the following morning. One quiet evening in the lobby of the Callaway Hotel. That was all it was supposed to be. She had not thought about Dante in months. She had trained herself, over years, to move through her days without the particular ache that his memory carried. It was not that she had stopped loving him. It was that she had gotten very good at not looking at that part of herself. She was checking her phone, confirming the morning's schedule with her assistant, when she felt it. There is a specific sensation that comes from being watched by someone who knows you. It is different from being observed. It has a weight to it, a particular pressure at the back of the neck. Alina had felt it enough times in the years after she left Boston that she had learned to trust it. She looked up. Dante was standing 40 feet away on the other side of the lobby, frozen mid-step, a phone loose in his hand, staring at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before and never expected to. He looked like a man who had just heard a sound in an empty house. He was older. Of course he was. 8 years older, harder in the jaw, the lines around his eyes deeper, the way he held himself carrying more weight than she remembered. He wore an impeccable dark suit and the particular stillness of a man who had long since stopped needing to perform authority for anyone. 2 men stood at the room's edges in the way she remembered, the specific kind of still. He was more powerful than when she'd left, more dangerous, more everything. And he was looking at her like she was the only real thing in the room. Alina looked back down at her phone. Don't react. Breathe. The side corridor was 30 feet to her left. If she stood up now, naturally took Mateo's hand, walked toward the elevator. Mateo's seat was empty. She looked up and her heart dropped completely out of her chest, because her son was already halfway across the marble lobby, blazer neat, chin level, walking with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who had made a decision and saw no reason not to act on it. She watched him stop 3 feet from Dante Valcourt, tilt his head and speak. And the lobby held its breath. "You still haven't told me your name," Mateo said. looking up at Dante with the calm patience of someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. Dante crouched down slowly, like he was being careful not to startle something rare. Dante. Dante. Mateo repeated it the way he repeated everything he wanted to remember, tasting the shape of it. Then, my mom went pale when she saw you. She only does that when something's important and she doesn't want me to know it yet. Smart kid. I just pay attention. A beat. Do you know her from before I was born? The question hit the air and stayed there. Elena reached them in 4 steps. Mateo, come with me right now. Mom. He looked at her, then at Dante, then back at her. And something moved through his expression that she had never seen before, something slow and terrible and certain. He has the same eyes as me. No one spoke. Dante stood. He was very still. His eyes found Elena's and the 8 years collapsed between them like a building coming down, all at once, in absolute silence. Elena, his voice was barely above a breath. She put her hand on Mateo's shoulder, firm and deliberate. We're leaving. He looks like me. Dante said it quietly, with the specific weight of a man watching his entire understanding of his own life rearrange itself into a shape he wasn't prepared for. Elena, is he? Don't. Tell me. His voice cracked on those 2 words, and it had nothing to do with power and everything to do with a man standing at the edge of something enormous and irreversible. Please, just tell me the truth. Mateo looked up at his mother. His expression was careful and still and patient. The expression of a boy who had been waiting a long time for the answer to a question he had never asked directly. Mom, he said quietly, I think you should. She didn't answer right away. She stood in the center of that lobby with her hand on her son's shoulder, and Dante Valcourt 2 feet in front of her, and 8 years of survival pressing against the back of her ribs, and she made herself breathe. Not here, she finally said. Dante nodded once. There's a private lounge on the 2nd floor. My people will make sure we're not disturbed. He paused. Please. It was the please that moved her. She had heard Dante Valcourt say a great many things in the time she'd known him. Confident things, careful things, occasionally ruthless things. She had never once heard him say please like it cost him something. She looked down at Mateo. He was looking up at her with those dark, steady eyes, waiting. Okay, she said, 10 minutes. The lounge was all dark wood and low light, the city visible through tall windows, the kind of room that cost more per hour than most people made in a day. Dante's men positioned themselves outside the door and disappeared from the conversation. Mateo sat in the center of a leather chair with his hands in his lap, like a small judge, preparing to hear arguments. Dante sat across from Elena. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at Mateo for a long moment, the way you look at something you cannot fully believe is real, taking inventory of every detail, storing it. How old are you? He asked. 7, Mateo said, and 4 months. Dante did the math. Elena watched him do it, watched the certainty settle into his expression and stay there. What's your full name? Mateo James Marsh. A pause. Marsh is my mom's name, her mother's name. Dante looked at Elena. You hid him. I protected him, she said. There is a difference. From me. From your family. From everything that comes with your name. She held his gaze and kept her voice even. You said your father couldn't know. Do you remember that? Because I do, word for word. That was the first thing you said. Dante's jaw tightened. I was trying to figure out how to handle it without putting you in danger. You were trying to handle it. That's exactly right. Like a problem, like something to be managed quietly. She leaned forward slightly. I was 24 years old, pregnant, and alone in a car outside your estate, and the man I loved looked at me like I was a complication. Dante said nothing. Your father had a journalist disappeared, Dante. I knew about that, and I knew that what I was carrying was either a weapon or a liability depending on how your family decided to look at it. Her voice didn't shake, but only because she had rehearsed this conversation in her head for 8 years. I couldn't afford to be wrong. Mateo had been listening to all of this with the focused attention he gave everything. Now he spoke. "Were you going to keep us a secret?" he asked Dante, not accusatory, genuinely curious the way he asked all his real questions. "If she hadn't left, were you going to tell your family?" Dante looked at the boy for a long moment. "I was planning to," he said slowly. "I needed time to figure out how to do it in a way that kept your mother safe. My father he was not a reasonable man. I had to be careful." "But you didn't tell her that." Dante closed his eyes briefly. "No, I didn't tell her that." "That seems like important information to leave out," Mateo observed. Elena almost laughed. She caught it and pressed her lips together. Dante looked back at her. "I know, you're right. I handled it badly. I was 24 hours into processing something enormous and I handled it badly, and you were gone before I could fix it." "You looked for us?" Elena asked. "For years." His voice was flat and unadorned, which somehow made it worse. "I hired investigators, 3 different firms over 4 years. Your father's name, your mother's maiden name, every professional trail I could find. You were thorough." "I had to be." "I know." He looked at Mateo again. "I know." A silence settled, not hostile, something more complicated than that. Mateo uncrossed his ankles, recrossed them. "My mom works very hard," he said. "In case that wasn't clear, she started her own company. She's good at it." Dante looked at Elena. Something moved in his eyes. "I believe it." "She doesn't sleep enough," Mateo continued. "And she drinks too much coffee and she sometimes works until midnight when she thinks I'm asleep, but she's always at breakfast, every single morning." He said this last part with a weight that made it clear it was not a small thing to him. "She never missed breakfast." Elena's throat tightened. Dante said quietly, "She sounds like an extraordinary person." "She is," Mateo agreed. "So whatever you're thinking about doing next, you should probably keep that in mind." They stayed in that lounge for 2 hours. Elena had told herself 10 minutes. But somewhere in the first half hour, while Dante was asking Mateo careful, genuine questions and Mateo was answering them with the same deliberate honesty he gave everyone, she found herself staying because she couldn't make herself leave. She watched Dante discover his son in real time, watched him ask about school and books and what Mateo liked to do on Saturday mornings, and watched Mateo answer without performance, just the plain truth of himself, which was considerable. She watched Dante laugh at something Mateo said about a documentary he'd been watching about migratory birds, a real laugh, surprised and genuine, and she recognized it from a long time ago. She had fallen in love with that laugh first, before everything else. At some point, Dante looked at her across the low table and said, "I owe you an apology that I don't think I have the words for yet." "You don't have to." "I do." He was quiet for a moment. "I've had 8 years of not knowing what happened. 8 years of wondering if you left because you didn't love me or because I scared you or because I failed you. And the answer is that I failed you and you still managed to build something extraordinary because of it and in spite of it, and I am—" He stopped, pressed his hands flat on his thighs. "I am sorry, Elena, for the week I asked you to wait, for the sentence I said that sent you running. For every day of the last 8 years. She looked at him for a long time. "I know," she said finally. "I know you are." Mateo looked between them with the expression of someone watching a long-running negotiation approach a resolution. He said nothing, which was, for him, a significant act of restraint. Before they left that evening, Dante asked for one thing. He looked at Mateo and said, "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I'd like to see you again if that's something you'd want." Mateo thought about this with the seriousness he gave all significant questions. "Do you play chess?" Dante blinked. "Yes." "Are you good?" "I'm decent." Mateo nodded slowly. "Okay, we can start there." In the elevator on the way up to their room, Elena looked down at her son, who was staring at the floor numbers like he was thinking something through. "Are you okay?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I always knew there was a reason you ran. I just didn't know what it was." "I was scared," she said simply. "I was scared and I was protecting you." I know, he looked up at her. You did the right thing. She pulled him close and held on to him in that small elevator with the city sliding past the gaps in the door. And she thought about every decision she had made since the night she packed 2 suitcases and stepped into the dark. Every sacrifice that didn't feel like a sacrifice because the alternative was unthinkable. Every morning she'd shown up at the breakfast table no matter what. She had done it alone, and she had done it right, and now she was here. Whatever happened next, whatever slow and careful thing might or might not rebuild itself between her and Dante, whatever new shape her life might take, she had done her part. She had kept him safe. She had made him whole. And her son, her 7-year-old boy with the old eyes and the steady hands, had walked across a marble lobby and forced the truth into the open. She kissed the top of his head. "Thank you," she said quietly, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. "I know," Mateo said against her shoulder. "You're welcome." 3 days later, Dante called. He asked if he could come to her office. Not the hotel, not somewhere neutral and managed. Her office, her space, her ground. She understood what he was doing and she let him. He sat across from her desk in a city that had been hers alone for 3 years and said, "I'm not going to pretend I know how to do this. I've never done this." "Neither have I," she said. "Done this, I mean any of it." "I want to be in his life," he paused, "if you'll let me." She looked at him carefully. This was the thing she had been turning over for 3 days in every quiet moment, late at night when Mateo was asleep, in the shower, on the train. Whether she could trust him. Whether the man sitting across from her was genuinely different from the man who had sent her running, or whether she was about to make the same mistake with 8 years of additional consequence. "Your father," she said, "is he still?" "He died 4 years ago." Dante's voice was even. "I run the family now." "That doesn't automatically make things safe." "No, it doesn't." He didn't try to argue with this, which she noticed. "What I can tell you is that the things I've spent the last 4 years doing have been, in large part, about making it possible to have exactly this conversation. Pulling back from operations that couldn't survive daylight, restructuring toward things that could. It's not finished. I won't pretend it is, but I am not my father." She studied him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I spent 8 years looking for you and rehearsing what I would say when I found you. And somewhere in all of that, I figured out that the version of me who existed when you left was not a version of me you should have trusted with something as important as a child." He met her eyes. "I needed to become someone worth finding." The room was very still. "That's a good answer," she said finally. "It's the true one." She looked out the window at the street below, at the ordinary city doing its ordinary work, and she thought about the girl she had been at 23, driving through iron gates and telling herself she knew where the line was. She thought about the woman she had become in the years since, harder in some ways, more careful, more certain of her own capacity to survive. She thought about Mateo. Asking careful questions around the edges of things he already half understood. She turned back to Dante. "We take it slowly," she said. "Mateo sets the pace, not you, not me." "Agreed. If at any point I feel like he's in danger, from your family or from anything connected to your name, this ends immediately. No negotiation." "Agreed." "And Dante," she held his gaze, "I am not 24 anymore. I am not someone who waits for a week while someone else decides what to do with my life." Something moved in his expression. Respect, she thought, real and uncomplicated. "I know," he said. "That much is obvious." The first time Dante came to their apartment, Mateo had left a chessboard set up on the kitchen table. He walked Dante through the apartment with the same measured tour he gave everyone who came to their home, pointing out what mattered and what didn't with the efficiency of a small architect. He showed Dante his bookshelf, organized by subject, then alphabetically within each subject, and when Dante pulled out a title and said he'd read it, Mateo's expression shifted from politely welcoming to genuinely interested. They played chess for 2 hours. Dante won the first game. Mateo won the second. When Dante looked up from the board after that second game, his expression was something between stunned and delighted. "You hustled me." I let you see how I played and then I adjusted, Mateo said. That's not hustling, that's adapting. Alina stood in the kitchen doorway watching them and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight for 8 years. She didn't know what the future was going to look like. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that there was still a great deal of careful, uncertain ground between here and anything she would call a life built together. There was history to process and trust to construct, and the particular complexity of introducing a child to the father he'd never had, slowly and without pressure, one chess game and one honest conversation at a time. But she also knew this. Dante Valcourt had spent 8 years becoming someone worth finding. And she had spent 8 years becoming someone who could look a man like that in the eye and tell him exactly what she needed without apologizing for it. And her 7-year-old son had walked across a marble lobby in a navy blazer and started all of it. The chessboard clicked. Someone laughed. She went back to making dinner. 2 months into the visits, Mateo made an announcement at breakfast. He was eating toast and reading the news on his tablet, a habit Alina had given up trying to argue him out of, when he looked up and said, "I think you should tell him how you feel." Alina set down her coffee. "Excuse me." "It's been 2 months. You both do that thing when you think the other person isn't looking." He went back to his toast. "It's obvious." "You're 7. You say that like it changes what I observe." She stared at him for a moment. "What exactly do you think you observe?" Mateo set down his tablet. He gave her the look he reserved for questions he considered beneath the intelligence of the person asking them. "You laugh differently when he's here, and he looks at you the way people look at things they're afraid of losing." He picked his tablet back up. "That's all I'm saying." Alina was quiet for a moment. "When did you get so perceptive?" she said finally. Mateo glanced up. "I've always been this perceptive. You just don't usually ask." She laughed. She couldn't help it. It came out of her like something she'd been holding without knowing, and once it started it took a while to stop, and by the end of it, her eyes were wet and Mateo was watching her with an expression of mild concern. "I'm fine," she told him. "I'm fine. I'm just you're a lot, do you know that?" "I've been told," he said calmly. "Is that a yes or a no?" She thought about Dante, about the man he'd become and the boy he'd been, and the 8 years that existed between those two things. About what it meant to trust someone again after you'd built your entire life around not needing to. About the possibility that the ending of a story didn't have to be the same as its beginning. "I'll think about it," she told Mateo. He nodded, satisfied. "That's a yes," he said, and went back to his reading. Alina picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the morning city and thought, maybe it is. This is part 1. The story continues.